When people picture hospitality in ancient Greece, they usually picture xenia, the sacred law of guest friendship. A stranger arrives at a door, is welcomed without being asked his name, given water to wash, food, wine, and a bed, and treated as though he might be a god in disguise. This picture is accurate. It comes directly from Greek religion and literature. Zeus carried the title Xenios, protector of guests and strangers, and a household that turned away a traveler risked divine punishment. But this describes only one part of how the Greeks handled travelers, and not the part that applied to most people, most of the time. Xenia was a private relationship, usually between people who already had some connection, or who belonged to a class in which reciprocal hospitality functioned as an ongoing, almost formal bond passed down through families across generations. It did not describe what happened when an ordinary person, with no local contacts and no history of guest friendship in a given city, simply needed a bed for one night in an unfamiliar town. For that traveler, a separate and far less dignified system existed, and understanding it changes the picture of daily travel in the ancient Greek world considerably. Greece was comparatively slow to develop commercial lodging at all, and for centuries private hospitality substituted for anything resembling an inn. When commercial lodging finally became common, in the classical period and after, it took a modest form, and in most surviving literary references, an unflattering one. Greek sources use several different words for these places, and the differences between the words show how travelers were sorted and treated depending on who they were and what resources they had. The word most often translated as inn is pandokeion, sometimes written pandokeion, built from pan, meaning all, and a form of the verb dechomai, to receive. A pandokeion received everyone, without the distinctions that governed private hospitality. Anyone who could pay was let in, regardless of where he came from or whether anyone in the household knew his name. This is the opposite of how xenia worked, which operated through relationships, gifts, and memory across generations. In Homer's Iliad, two warriors on opposite sides of the Trojan War, Diomedes and Glaucus, stopped fighting on the battlefield once they realized their grandfathers had once exchanged the gifts of guest friendship. That relationship still mattered generations later. A pandokeion mattered no further than the price of a room for one night. A related but different word, kapelion, is usually translated as tavern, a place to buy and drink wine, often mixed with water and served from large storage jars, which might or might not also offer a place to sleep. Kapelos, the word for the person who ran one, also meant a small retailer, carrying a negative sense of someone focused on petty profit. Comic writers treated the kapelion as an ordinary fixture of city life, mentioned so casually that its presence was clearly taken for granted, even while the people running these places were mocked or distrusted. Aristocrats generally avoided drinking in public at a kapelion, preferring the symposium, a private drinking party held inside a home and reserved for men of a certain standing. The kapelion served everyone else: laborers, foreigners, sailors passing through a port, and in some periods women and enslaved people, sharing a public space the elite considered beneath them. A third term, katagogion, served as a general word for lodging or a guest house, without the negative undertone of kapelion. It described both ordinary lodging houses and, as later sections show, the large guest complexes built at major religious sanctuaries. Finally, there is proxenia, which extended the private relationship of xenia into formal politics. A city-state would name a citizen of another city-state as its proxenos, an official host responsible for the interests of visitors from the city that appointed him, meeting delegations, resolving disputes, and arranging for their needs in exchange for public honors. It functioned as an early form of consular representation between city-states, centuries before Rome developed anything comparable, and its existence shows that ordinary travelers without political standing had no equivalent system and had to manage commercial lodging entirely on their own. It helps to picture what staying in one of these places actually involved. A typical pandokeion of the classical period was not built for comfort. Surviving descriptions and the practical requirements of the trade indicate a simple structure organized around a central courtyard, enclosed by walls, with one gate that could be barred once night fell. There was rarely anything resembling a private room. One ancient discussion of daily habits, describing behavior appropriate for a traveler in this kind of building, notes in passing that it made no difference whether a guest was aboard a ship or lodged among many other people at an inn, since privacy was equally absent in either case. Guests slept in a shared space, on the floor or a raised platform, using whatever bedding they had carried with them, lit only by oil lamps after dark, on floors of packed earth or plain stone. Conversation in different dialects, the movement of animals nearby, and the smell of cooking and wine all mixed together in the same enclosed courtyard once the gate was barred for the night. Water access determined where these buildings could be located. Greek wine was strong and always diluted before drinking, so any establishment serving it needed a dependable well or cistern nearby. And this single requirement is one of the main methods modern archaeologists use to guess at the likely location of a kapelaion on an ancient town plan, since the buildings themselves are remarkably hard to identify through their remains alone. Researchers have noted that these commercial spaces are strangely absent from the archaeological record, given how often they appear in comedy and other written sources. And recent scholarship suggests one reason. Many were not purpose-built commercial structures at all, but ordinary houses adapted for the trade, indistinguishable from private homes once only foundations remain. Animals were kept in the same enclosure as the travelers, or in an adjacent space, since a pack animal represented a serious investment, and the courtyard of a pandokion combined the noise and smell of mules, donkeys, or oxen, with dozens of unrelated strangers sharing one enclosed space for a single night. Not every guest structure in the Greek world matched this modest description. At Olympia, a large building called the Leonidaion was built around 330 BCE at the edge of the sanctuary, designed by the architect Leonidas of Naxos, a central courtyard surrounded by a Doric colonnade of 44 columns, with an outer ring of 138 Ionic columns, making it the largest secular structure on the site. Rooms opened off the courtyard on every side, with the widest and most impressive rooms set aside on the western side of the building. But the Leonidaion was not built for the ordinary spectator. It was reserved for distinguished officials, ambassadors, and other high-status guests attending the Olympic Games, showing that formal elite hospitality could be built on a monumental scale whenever a sanctuary chose to invest in it. A comparable case exists at Epidaurus, the sanctuary of the healing god Asclepius. Visitors arrived seeking a cure, and the sanctuary built a vast guest house, the Catagogion, to house them. A nearly square building of close to 6,000 square meters, with as many as 160 rooms, across what was likely 2 stories. Patients might stay for days or weeks, taking part in prayer, offerings, supervised exercise, and the central healing ritual, sleeping in a separate hall in hope of a dream from the god. Both buildings make one point clear. The modest, crowded pandokion of ordinary travel was not the result of any general Greek inability to build proper lodging. It was a matter of who the lodging was for. The people who relied on a pandokion or kapelaion for a night's shelter came from a wide range of backgrounds, but shared one thing. None had a xenos, a guest friend, waiting in the town where they had stopped. Merchants moving goods between city-states made up a large share of this group, since a trader carrying textiles, oil, grain, or pottery between ports could not realistically maintain personal guest friendships in every town he passed through, so commercial lodging was simply a cost of doing business. Religious travelers formed another large group. The sanctuaries at Olympia, Delphi, Isthmia, and Nemea hosted games and festivals on a fixed cycle, attracting visitors from across the Greek world, including official delegations called theoroi, sent by their home cities to represent them, and healing sanctuaries like Epidaurus drew a steady stream of the sick year-round. Soldiers and messengers needed lodging too, sometimes assisted by a proxenos if their errand was political, but often left to find commercial shelter like anyone else. Finally, there were the poor and laborers seeking work, people with no social standing that made the reciprocal obligations of Xenia realistic for them in the first place, since guest friendship worked best between people who could plausibly host each other in return. The Olympic Games offer the best documented example of what happened when all these groups converged at once. Ancient estimates put attendance at around 40,000 people, arriving in a district with no permanent housing outside the sanctuary's own buildings. Wealthy attendees and official delegations could afford elaborate tents, sometimes supplied by their home cities as a mark of prestige. One later writer described the tent set up for the Athenian statesman Alcibiades as larger than his own city's official delegation, equipped by allied cities competing to supply him with sacrificial animals and provisions. Everyone else, the great majority of the 40,000, camped on whatever open ground could be found, in makeshift shelters or the open air, for the full duration of the festival. Surviving accounts complain of heat, crowding, and a lack of water, since local rivers were known to run low in the summer month when the games were held, along with swarms of flies common enough to prompt sacrifices to Zeus under a title associated with driving them away. The philosopher Epictetus, urging an audience to bear discomfort with patience, listed the conditions any visitor to Olympia had to accept as ordinary: the heat, the crush of the crowd, the absence of decent bathing, getting soaked if it rained, treating all of it as a normal part of witnessing something worth the difficulty. Running a pandikaion or kapaileion was not a respected occupation. Comic literature treats innkeepers as stock figures of dishonesty, watering down wine, inflating prices, and taking advantage of travelers with no way to check if they were being cheated. A well-known character study from the 4th century BCE, describing a man defined by an excessive and petty love of money, lists innkeeping among a set of disreputable trades such a person would take up without hesitation, alongside tax collecting and working as a public crier. Ancient discussion of retail trade in general links this low reputation to the profit motive itself. Extending hospitality for payment struck many Greek writers as a distortion of what hospitality meant. Since real xenia was never supposed to involve payment, only gifts freely given and returned. Historical and archaeological research into who actually ran these establishments points to a workforce outside the citizen elite entirely. Women, foreigners without citizenship rights, and enslaved people are all attested working in kapaileia, a social position with almost nothing in common with the aristocratic host of a xenia relationship. Reaching a pandikaion at all required surviving the journey to it, and Greek roads were not reliably safe. Banditry on land and piracy at sea were persistent, well-documented problems, not occasional exceptions. Thucydides, writing about earlier generations of Greeks, noted that piracy along the coasts and islands had once been so common that it carried no particular shame and was treated as a normal way to make a living. Merchant ships loaded with cargo were an obvious target, adding the risk of capture and ransom to the ordinary dangers of storms and shipwreck. Travel by land carried its own risks from highwaymen operating along roads connecting major cities, particularly through rough or unpopulated terrain where a robbery could occur with no witnesses nearby. Greek mythology preserves a vivid record of exactly this anxiety, built around the legendary journey of the hero Theseus from his boyhood home in Troezen to Athens, where his father Aegeus ruled as king. Choosing the dangerous overland route over the safer option of traveling by sea, he confronted a series of named bandits, each tied to a specific stretch of road and method of preying on travelers. Near the cliffs by Megara, a robber named Sciron forced passing travelers to wash his feet before kicking them off the rocks to a waiting sea creature below. Further on, near Eleusis, a man named Procrustes offered exhausted travelers exactly what any tired person on that road would want most: a house to shelter in and a bed for the night. His bed, however, was rigged as a trap, stretching guests who were too short and cutting down those too tall, so that no one who accepted his hospitality left alive. The story reflects a real fear connected to the entire practice of Greek hospitality, that a stranger's offer of shelter and a bed, the very things Xenia promised to guarantee, could just as easily conceal violence instead of protection. Even inside a legitimate pandikaion, dangers did not disappear. Ancient discussions of travel describe landlords who routinely cheated guests over pricing, to the point that arranging a firm price in advance became standard practical advice. Some inns doubled as convenient hiding places for thieves, given the constant traffic of strangers and the difficulty of tracking who belonged there. Aristophanes, in his comedy *The Frogs*, has the god Dionysus ask which inns along a route have the fewest fleas, a joke that only works because the audience recognized insect infestations as an ordinary complaint about staying at one. Crowding, shared bedding, limited ventilation, and close contact with animals created a real risk of illness spreading among guests. though no one understood how disease actually traveled from person to person. Plato, in his work called The Laws, included specific proposals for regulating how resident foreigners and traveling guests should be treated and monitored, reflecting an assumption that hospitality towards strangers, however sacred in principle, still required civic oversight and could not simply be left to informal trust. The overall picture is consistent. Outside the personal, reciprocal world of xenia and the formal channels of proxenia, a traveler in the Greek world moved through conditions where danger, dishonesty, and discomfort were ordinary features of the road, managed and endured rather than eliminated. Bringing these pieces together clarifies what travel and lodging actually involved for different people. A merchant with an established guest friend in a given city received the full treatment described by Xenia: a welcome into a private home, a bath, a shared meal, a bed under a familiar roof, and an exchange of gifts on departure, without any payment for the hospitality itself. Without that connection, he instead sought a pandokion near the city gate, agreed a price before committing to food or a room, and spent the night in a shared courtyard among strangers he would likely never see again, his pack animals tied up close by. If traveling on official business, he might instead be met by the local proxinos, who could handle practical difficulties an ordinary merchant would otherwise manage alone. A family traveling to Epidaurus because one of them was seriously ill followed a different pattern entirely: ritual preparation, prayers and votive gifts at the temple, and then, for however many days or weeks the process required, housing in the catagogion, taking part in communal meals, and possibly attending the theater built into the site, since drama was considered part of the treatment. This was organized, sanctioned religious hospitality on a large scale, built and maintained by the sanctuary itself, and it differed completely from the ordinary pandokion a merchant might use on a routine trip. A spectator walking the considerable distance from Athens to Olympia, well over 300 kilometers, for no reason beyond personal devotion to the games, arrived to find almost no permanent housing at all. Unless he had the wealth for a private tent or a connection securing him one of the limited rooms in the Leonidion, he did exactly what tens of thousands of others did: found open ground and endured summer heat, short water, and constant crowding as a normal part of witnessing the festival. 3 journeys, 3 outcomes, and in each case the deciding factor was not the traveler's need, identical in every version, but his existing social position and whatever network he could call on when he arrived. Taken together, these systems reveal something specific about how Greek society actually distributed the value it placed on hospitality. As a religious principle, hospitality toward strangers was treated as close to absolute. Zeus himself was believed to protect guests and punish hosts who mistreated them, and Greek literature is full of stories built around this expectation, including the Trojan War itself, framed as a consequence of a guest violating his host's trust by taking something that was never his. But as a daily practice, the hospitality a person actually received depended heavily on status, family history, and whether he belonged to a network capable of extending or receiving it in return. A traveler with a guest friend, or an official with access to a proxinos, experienced something close to the religious ideal: personal, generous, free of charge. A traveler without either experienced something much closer to an ordinary commercial transaction, in a crowded, poorly regarded building, with a price negotiated in advance to guard against being cheated, and no particular assurance of safety once the gate was shut for the night. The myths the Greeks told about the road reflect this same tension rather than resolving it. Stories that reward guest friendship across generations exist alongside stories, like that of Procrustes, that dramatize exactly the opposite fear: a host whose offer of shelter turns out to be a trap. Both kinds of stories came from the same culture at the same time, which suggests that the sacred ideal of automatic trust between stranger and host was never something the Greeks took entirely for granted in daily life, however firmly they upheld it in religious language. Reading Greek comedy, philosophy, and inscriptions about lodging and travel with this fuller picture in mind changes how those references should be understood. A joke about fleas in an inn, a philosopher's complaint about a festival crowd, a character sketch mocking a dishonest innkeeper, an inscription honoring a generous proxinos. None of these are isolated details. They are pieces of a single, functioning system for moving people around the ancient Greek world, defined far more by a traveler's social standing and material limitations than by comfort, and understanding how that system actually worked gives a far more accurate account of daily travel in the ancient Greek world.